there wasn't a lot of money, but my mother was very determined, and while she was carrying me, she was reading a book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. So that was ingrained into my genes before I was even born. And I think that's the whole thing, is that when you know that things can be forecast and when you can have a roadmap ahead, then you can plan yourself with a bit more certainty for yourself and your family. What we do in flying airliners is exactly as you said. Our duty is to identify the forthcoming risks and reduce that, and if we take the edges of an envelope, we want to be as far away from those edges as possible.
My guest for this episode is Andrew Pancholi. Andrew specialises in using mathematical cycles to forecast events in geopolitics and markets. He's the creator of the highly acclaimed Market Timing Report and is the co-author of the best-selling book 0 Hour. Also a commercial airline pilot, Andrew has a deep knowledge of risk management based on aviation safety and applies these concepts to trading and portfolio management. He consults to some of the largest banks and institutions in the world and advises government agencies and the military. He also sits on the board for the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, set up by the US Presidency in 1941. I was first introduced to Andrew last year and was fascinated by his ability to identify patterns and accurately forecast future events. So I wanted to get him on the show to talk about his experience and how it relates to the world of business and pitching. If you enjoy what you hear, please leave a review, like, comment and subscribe. It would mean the world to me and will help this podcast reach as many people as possible. You don't want to miss this. Enjoy. Andrew, welcome to the show. My first question for you. In life or business, what is the most important thing that you've ever had to pitch for?
Oh, that's a really great one. In fact, it's going to be a convoluted answer. So the idea is that, well, for my life, I had a passion, and then I learned that not everybody shares the same passion. So it's this idea of finding somebody that wants your passion, and so it's rather than I have this, I love it, you should have it, which I discovered is the number one rule of not how you do pitching. It's really how this is going to work for you, Dominic, why you need this and why you can't live without it from this minute onwards. So I think that's probably how I would pre-frame that. Does that answer your initial question?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the kind of the biggest pitch in your life, what's really kind of tested your abilities to get what you want?
I think it's really the whole thing's been if we go back to when I was younger and I was going for job interviews in more formal professions, including the one I'm in now, it was sort of how do you're pitching yourself, why should they want you? And I do remember in those cases literally remember talking to somebody and said we might have a job in 2 weeks' time, and it's like, well, I'll drive down. Well, when? He said, well, I can get in a car now and I can be with you in 5 hours, because I was living pretty close to you in Yorkshire there, Dominic.
Okay.
So that in itself was a subconscious pitch. It's like, that's how keen I am. And I remember going down there and the guy gave me the job, and he was my boss, but his superior said, as long as the guy's half reasonable, give him the job, because we can always sack him a month later if he's useless. But the fact that he's prepared to drive 240 miles at 1 hour's notice shows a degree of enthusiasm. So that's one pitch. And then other pitches as I've gone along are really, as I think that's really mentioned, is having a passion and then realizing that you want to share it with people. And then you realize not everybody's quite as passionate about your passion as you are, but there are people that are. And so it's about finding those people.
Yeah.
And in fact, the real answer to your question is actually going into authenticity. So rather than this idea of, hey, Dominic, you need this, or, hey, such and such, this is for you, this is going to change your life. It's actually, I'm here, this is what I do. If it appeals to you, come and talk to me. So it's the subtle thing. It's not a pitch. It's a non-pitch. It's a subtle thing. It's like, I'm here, I'm passionate about this. If it's your gig, or it might be your gig, I'm happy to talk to you. And I think that's what works.
Awesome. We're going to delve into some of this later, but you've had a really kind of interesting and varied career. If you think back to the things that didn't quite work out, is there a pitch that got away? Is there something that you think, oh God, if I could have gone back and had another go, I'd have loved to have seen where that led?
Yes and no. So there's two sides to this. So at the time, you think I really messed that up, and you'd come away downhearted. But now you realise that every time it didn't work, it opened the door to something else.
Yeah.
And you can argue about this. I mean, this is a bit tangential, but relationships are pitches. Let's face it. When a relationship ends or something like that, and it's like feels like the end of the world, and it can be a business relationship or a an intimate romantic relationship, and it's sort of you go through this phase, but then you meet somebody else and you get something even better.
Yeah.
And I think this is the point. So the old me would be, oh, for sure, there have been points, well, we really messed that one up, didn't we? There's things where we did a pitch, and there was my coach was off camera, and it was in the very early days of pre-Zoom. We're probably going back 10-15 years plus. I'm trying to think what it was. It was just a voice only pitch.
Yeah.
And the guy, my coach, immediately go, yeah, well done, yeah, that's great. And then I think he really fell for this and he really fell for that, and then we realised the mic was still hot, so we never heard from them again. So that's a failed pitch if you ever wanted one.
Yeah, that's there's definitely some lessons to be learned there, I think.
Yeah, so just be a bit careful, watch out for, or not even finger trouble. But then the other side of it, as I get older, I think everything happens for a reason. We're talking today for a reason. Our paths crossed through a mutual friend, and through that lies the forgive me for getting a bit esoteric. I'm fascinated by esoteric stuff, but the universe or the cosmos can guide you. And there's one person I know who introduced me to another person who basically got me down another road. And through that passageway and pathway, I joined something else, and I met somebody else, and I met my wife. Equally, that same pathway, I invested in a company and lost my entire fortune at one point. So it's sort of a bit like the Matrix, the blue pill or the red pill,
yeah.
if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. I mean, you're an expert in cycles, and you use those mathematical patterns to forecast events in geopolitics and in the markets. You advise banks, government agencies, the military. But what's your story? Because I don't think anyone kind of is born seeing those patterns, or maybe they are. So as a kid, what interested you? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, so bearing my whole life here, when I was answering that second question last and then moving forward, I went on a plane when I was 4 years old, and you can see, from my skin color, I'm from a different ethnicity. So we went to India when I was 4, and I remember that's probably my most clear, vivid memory. And I just remember being obsessed with that summer holiday. Well, I probably hadn't even started school, and I just remember and I remember going up to the flight deck, and I just thought this was so cool. So as I was growing up, I also had quite a fascination for economics. I had a great economics teacher when I was studying over in Leeds. And my father, being from an Indian Asian background, didn't like the idea of pilots, either doctors or business or something like that. And so I followed two careers, and I went off and did a degree in economics and accountancy. At the same time, whilst pursuing a career in flying, knowing full well that at that time, flying was a very difficult area to get into. The airlines were in recession, if not depression. They weren't recruiting. So the idea was that, well, be successful in business. But one of the things that hit me, and I think this is a really pivotal point, when I was doing my first degree in economics, suddenly they started bringing in a lot more calculus and econometrics. So some of you will understand this. I won't go too deeply into this, but everything was now defined by a mathematical equation. And I always remember saying, who says that the flow of money is this? I honestly just lost my passion. But the other side of it was that we did also have modules in social and economic history, and you could see the evolution of this. And there was one particular thing that caught my eye, which was a 55 to 60-year-old pattern, a repeating pattern called the Kondratiev wave. identified by a Russian economist who said that economies moved in these patterns and commodity markets and so on. So that caught my attention. And the more I looked at this, the more passionate I got about this. And so it just became a hobby in the 20s. At the same time, I did get some breaks in flying, and I studied them both. And then I think by the time I got to 30, I was on a mission then, really, about getting to the bottom of this stuff. And I discovered actually there's one, there's a guy called W.D. Gann who was able to forecast markets seemingly to some degree. And the more I looked into his work, I thought there is some credibility here. Mm-hmm. And he was born in 1878. He died in 1955. He was allegedly worth 50 million at the time. So he'd be like a modern day billionaire. He had an airliner as his own private aircraft. And he could, look at crop forecasts. And the more we looked at this, I realized that war cycles repeat, commodity cycles repeat, and human behavior repeats. So now this was the cool thing. You realize that, as the good, but and the core texts of so many religions talk about these cycles, albeit in a veiled manner. But there's a generational cycle of either 18.6 years, 20 years, and each generation learns off the other until you get 3 generations on where they stop learning, because basically nobody wants to listen to somebody who's 80 or 90 who's lived through it all before. And that's why the big wars repeat. And, just sort of a little bit of a tangent, but very relevant. We had 9/11, September the 11th, 2001. America's attacked on its own soil. And the only other time America's been attacked on its own soil is exactly 60 years previously in 1941 on December the 7th at Pearl Harbor. So you can see this 60-year pattern playing out. So it was this sort of fascination. I mean, I was already into it, but before 9/11 happened. So it's like a massive puzzle to me. And, I spend hours researching it every day, writing about it. And what I found then was markets. There's obviously the ability to trade them and therefore, create an additional income. But markets, Dominic, are so important, because if I said to you, Dominic, what happened to you on, say, the 8th of April 2005, you probably don't recall unless something big happened.
No
right?
idea. Yeah.
But you can look at a market chart, and I know some of you will not be that familiar, but a market chart has an open, high, low, and close for the day, and this is the feeling or the sentiment of the market. So basically, if you wake up, say, well, let's look at my market chart for today. I woke up excited today because I knew I was going to speak to you. Some other interesting things happening today. And, so I've started off fairly high and we've carried on up higher. Now, I don't know if the wife's going to come home with bad news or whatever and we close the day lower, or whether we carry on up to a high. Well, you see a market chart, a bar chart for a day shows that today the market opened. It had a bit of a boring afternoon, or morning rather. It was a bit sad. Then it closed higher. And then it closed. So by looking at all these patterns in markets, you can judge human sentiment, because a market chart, be it the FTSE 100, the S&P, gold, whatever it's Bitcoin, is a reflection of the human's behavior. And then what you will also see is that at extremes of optimism or pessimism, you see really big moves as everybody thinks, oh, this is terrible. think about how we all felt during the pandemic, or maybe, there have been happier times. And I sort of think, perhaps, when we've been celebrating more positive times, there is this mass hysteria. And you also think back to, I suspect you're maybe a bit young to remember when John Lennon died, but I remember there was this mass sort of depression about the place when John Lennon was shot. The same when Princess Diana, but most of us never met her or knew anything other than she was a global figure. So you could see this mass sentiment coming in. And equally, when we win a good game or the World Cup or something like that, we're generally pretty excited, aren't we? So in answer to your question, this ability to measure human behavior or sentiment, and then to discover, because you've got a mathematical model, that it repeats, and it can repeat on generational levels at 20 years. It can repeat every 2 or 3 months. It can repeat every few days. Suddenly you think, this is a puzzle that really is fascinating me, or maybe I should just get a life instead.
So take me back a little bit to that young, 4-year-old boy that wanted to be the pilot, or got to go up into the flight deck. you mentioned a kind of generational pattern within your own family that says, okay, you need to be a business person or a doctor. How did you kind of negotiate that path to following that boyhood dream and becoming a pilot? It sounds like you had to, do some things in parallel. But what were those first experiences that actually kind of saw you on your way?
So I think the greatest influence here is my mother, who, because we came from, let's face it, first generation migrants. My parents, although I was born over here, um, so there wasn't a lot of money, but my mother was very determined. And while she was carrying me, she was reading a book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. So that was ingrained into my genes before I was even born. And she would always say, just believe you can do it. And
Mhm.
one of the things that stopped the flying to start with was glasses. It's like, well, nobody wears glasses. And actually, you find you can wear glasses, and so on. And she always says, don't stop believing. And he said, if you can visualize your outcome. So, despite the fact I thought the flying was quite a remote dream,
Mm.
um, there was this idea that if you stayed focused, and one of my great mentors when I did start flying, and what I did was I followed this. I just thought I'd do it, and then I remember thinking, if I got a job whilst I was in the sixth form, just stacking shelves or actually working in a car park, getting £1 an hour as it was, then if I saved up, I could get every 3 weeks I could get a flying lesson.
Mhm.
And so that was the first stage. And then people saying, well, you're never really going to get it cracked if you're only going to fly once every 3 weeks. And it was like, well, that's all I can afford, so I'm on my mission. But I got my private pilot's license up in Leeds there. And one of my mentors, who was the chief flying instructor, he was a really fabulous guy, a very unassuming guy. He would always dress in a sort of, people you would sometimes think he was a down and out the way he presented himself, because he
Yeah.
didn't care. All right, he didn't care what people thought of him. He was actually from the landed gentry, and he was also a fabulous air racer. He was the equivalent of the Michael Schumacher, or like Max Verstappen now in Formula
Yeah.
One. He'd win 10 of the 12 races, the rallies of the year. And he'd sit there and he'd say, so, what are you going to do, Andy? And I was like, I said, well, I wouldn't mind flying that plane over there. And he said, no, come on, you want to aim higher than a six-seater twin. And then he said, well, what about, you should aim for something really big. And I said, well, that's totally impossible. There's only a handful of people that have been astronauts or who've flown supersonic jets. And he said, Andy, that's not the right answer. He said, the right answer is somebody's got to do it. It might as well be me. So that comment, together with my mum's mental support all the way through, and my mum's still alive, and she, even now, I mean, she's 89, she's very infirm, she's still got a strong mind.
Mm.
So those two, that comment together with this, and I think if I can put that out to your followers, Dominic, somebody's got to do it. It might as well be you. I think that is the most thing. It's like, okay, well, it's my job now. That's it. I've got to do it because somebody's got to do it. It might as well be me. And it is with that mission and that mindset that I carry on my research in cycles, thinking somebody's got to crack this. And we're still here 40 years later, nearly doing it.
Do you remember that first flight? The first time that you actually had your hands on the sticks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I remember it very clearly, and to this day, that flying instructor, I'm still in touch with him. He was the opposite. He was a real sort of fascinating guy. He was not a conventional guy, so he became a ferry pilot, or just anything that had huge amounts of risk. He would love doing, like taking a single engine aircraft across the Pacific, the Atlantic. He lives in New Zealand now, and that's the nature. But yeah, I'm still in touch with him, and dare I say it, that was 45 years ago. That's yeah.
You
So
mentioned the word risk there, and I
yeah,
think that's so important in both of your careers because you still fly commercially, so you must have
I do.
a huge duty of care to your crew and to the passengers that you're flying. How how has that kind of understanding of risk developed through those two parallel careers?
So what we do in flying airliners is exactly as you said. Our duty is to identify the forthcoming risks and reduce that, and if we take the edges of an envelope, we want to be as far away from those edges as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And using that sort of stuff, we have a series of competencies, we call them pilot competencies, but they're applicable to everybody in life. And whatever business you're in, think about this. And there are all sorts of things like communication, leadership and teamwork, problem solving and decision making, as well as, application of knowledge and procedures. But most importantly is the one called situational awareness.
Okay.
Situational awareness, whether you're in business, whatever it is, whatever you're doing, is about knowing what is happening around you. So if you understand situational awareness about your industry, your product, your game. So let's start off with flying. Well, situational awareness for a flight as well. We start off, we do a briefing. What's the weather like if we're going to New York? What risks are we facing en route if we go to Hong Kong? But then, well, what if we have a problem? What if we have a technical problem, an engine failure? Where are we going to divert to? What's the weather like at our alternates? How much extra fuel do we need, if any, or can we manage the fuel accordingly? So it's all about knowing that. And that would be the situational awareness for one dynamic flight. And we update that in terms of dynamic situational awareness. Well, we're halfway there. We've passed Iceland, we've passed the Azores. Where are we going to go to now? Maybe we're going to look at Newfoundland. So that's one thing. So taking this situational awareness into, say, cycles, which is my passion now, is that if you have an idea of what lies ahead, okay, then you can be prepared for it. So perhaps one of the things that we identified very clearly and forewarned people back in 2018 was the forthcoming pandemic. So if you look at sentiment of people, most people are saying nobody could have seen the pandemic coming. Okay, it was a black swan, this black swan concept. Mm-hmm. So my argument is there is no such thing as a black swan. It is basically a cycle that hasn't been recognized or identified. So if we look at the pandemic, we'd written in 2018 because 100 years ago we had the Spanish flu pandemic post First World War. 200 years ago, we had the first cholera pandemic, which wiped out tens of millions in Asia. Then it came across Europe and into Britain as well. 300 years ago, we had the smallpox pandemic in North America, and the same again 400 years ago, which wiped out the First Nation people. So there's a clear pattern of pandemics, but you can take that and look at the midpoints. And if you go back to, say, 1620 and add half of that, 1670, 1666 was the plague in London, that was, the Great Fire sort of cleaned that one up. So you can see these patterns repeat. And it's this ability to look backwards and then project forwards that increases our ability to sort of understand what's happening in terms of situational awareness. And one of the things I say, it's sort of all well and good if you're looking at a little stream thinking this is a nice place to have a picnic and do a bit of fishing, but you really need to know about the tsunami that might be coming along somewhere else. So so whatever your industry is, those of you watching this thing, think about what the threats are. So, one of the examples I give when giving talks is, well, who still has a fax machine?
Yeah.
You can keep, and what did people want till Henry Ford came along? They wanted faster horses, and then Henry Ford created the Model T. And then another big example is, especially in America and also in Europe in the 1880s, the railroads were it. That was the biggest technology and innovation, and then they were superseded by the aircraft in the 1920s. And in fact, Pan Am, Juan Trippe, and they built the Pan Am building right on top of Grand Central Station to say, we've got one up on you now.
Yeah.
And that was the peaking of the Vanderbilt, the Cornelius Vanderbilt, the E.H. Harriman Railroad era. So this is the sort of technology, isn't it? That's how it works. And there are we talked about the 100-year pattern there in pandemics. Most of the airlines started in 1919. Well, 2019 to 2020, the airlines took a huge hit because of the pandemic, And you take the half cycle, well, what happened in 1970? The jumbo jet came in, Concorde came in. That was the bit, we landed on the moon in 1969. I mean, these half cycles are absolutely perfect.
That's fascinating. That idea situational awareness is really interesting. From a macro level, but also on the micro level. And so one of the things I heard you say is, we have a briefing and we talk about these things, and I think that's actually so important when we think about business. If I think about a team going into a pitch, quite often if I'm working with a team, I will get them to create a checklist. Like literally, I need you to tick this thing off to say that you have done it before you walk in to the room, because I think in many professions now we assume that we can manage this stuff in our head, but it strikes me that in an airline environment, you're actually speaking these words out loud, even though it's business as usual. The actual act of articulating them brings them into consciousness and makes sure that you've kind of covered those things off. So I think there's massive lessons for people to learn from the process and the procedures that you have around risk and reward, I suppose, and how to mitigate those things by actually communicating about them. So there's so much in there. You've mentioned a couple of mentors already along the way, and it strikes me, with having two slightly kind of parallel careers, that you must have kind of mentors in both camps. So how have you developed those that team around you, and how have you approached people to help you grow your understanding?
That's a really great question. I think these people find you because you don't openly, I mean, certainly when you're younger, you don't openly look for mentors. You're not
Mm.
even sure what a mentor is at that point, and you
Yeah.
don't realize they're a mentor until afterwards, quite often. The gentleman I told you about, somebody's got to do it. It might as well be you. He disappeared. Sadly, he passed very early on in my life,
Hmm.
relatively speaking. I think I was probably in my early 30s. I dearly love him to be around now to, discuss some of the achievements and goals because of that. But, he was just there. And I think it's something I recognize as I'm a bit older. It's that how can you pay this forward?
Mm.
And so, for example, there's a couple of people that I've met actually over the holidays where I just think, look, let me spend some time with you if you want, and give you some ideas or pointers. And, you can call me if you want advice. So there's that. But how do they come in? They just seem to appear. And I think if you think somebody is interesting and fulfilling you,
Yeah.
okay, and is setting light bulbs off, and better still, now that we're older, making you feel a bit uncomfortable with things in the old days where you go like, no, thanks very much, bye, Now, actually, yeah, no, okay, tell me more. What is it you're saying? What is it? Okay, I don't particularly want to hear this, but I know I have to hear it. Or
Yeah.
I don't like hearing it, but tell me, because if I've got a blind spot, and let's face it, we all have blind spots, then
Hmm.
that's the area that if somebody can shine a light on it, you can grow. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. And in fact, if we bring this back to flying skills, there are three levels of operation in aircraft operation in terms of our capacity as human beings. And it's the same that's in life. It's in your personal life, in your business. And basically, you can either notice things and react to them.
Hmm.
You can understand things and then be slightly ready for them, or you can be thinking ahead and you can find those threats. You can identify those threats, and therefore you can head them off at the pass. And
Hmm.
that's so it's notice, understand, and think ahead. Now, if you have lots of capacity, then you've got plenty of time to think ahead. But
Yeah.
equally, if you're firefighting, then you're at the notice, level, and you've got to react. So notice is reacting. Thinking ahead is planning ahead. So
Hmm.
what is your industry? Who really does want it? Who does want what you have to offer? How
Yeah.
do you find them? What problem is it going to solve for them? And what's the threat to that industry? Right.
Mm.
So like we talked about fax machines, and there's so many other things that have just disappeared. Polaroid cameras, I
Yeah.
know they've come back as a bit of a
VHS. Yeah.
novelty. Yeah. So I think did we answer your question there? Or did we go a bit off
Yeah. No,
piece with that one?
absolutely. I think that leads me on to the market timing report, and the the idea to start sharing what I'm assuming was initially, a hobby, something that you were interested in, that you were using, then to actually, make the bold claim that I'm noticing patterns and I'm happy to share them. How did you build that business alongside, what is a very demanding day job as a pilot?
So the history of this goes back to really, the work I was talking about with researching WD Gann.
Yeah.
And it became evident. Well, first of all, there was nothing in Britain, and I finally got hold of the lady, Nikki Jones. She was over in Washington State, pretty close to Seattle, maybe 8 hours drive from Seattle. And I thought, well, I'm looking for this stuff. So I said to her, "Can I start buying this and importing it and be like a little, be an agent distributor?" So that's how it first started.
Interesting.
And the techniques were so complex that I started working with a couple of people again in America, but then realized I needed to sort of do my own programming. And suddenly this is, well, oh, this is way beyond my wallet. But then we thought, well, hang on, if it works, if this works, then we should be able to trade it. So we started trading and made a bit of money, and then we made a bit more money. And then events occurred in such a way that I met somebody who actually became a very suitable business partner, and we made a reasonable amount of money. And I thought, I'm just going to put this back in and program this stuff.
Yeah.
So we put all this money in, or I put this money in, programmed, paid a programmer, and we ran up huge debts. And the accountants sort of say, right, so we're now sitting on X 100,000 of debt. What's the business plan? Because the tax man's going to get pretty interested if you carry on like this. So,
Yeah.
so what happened was, so we'll do anything. We did actually sell some of this information to hedge funds, because the idea is that it helps their situational awareness. If they know that gold is going to turn next month or the third week of March or whatever, or next August or in 2026, they can plan for that. So we've got a couple of clients. Didn't really generate a huge amount of revenue, but it did, it kept the business going. And then it got to the point where, like, we can't mess around. This is a very small amount of revenue. So I said, well, I'll do anything apart from write a report, because I don't want to go into the retail area. So anyway, the long and short of it is I write a report, because people kept saying, can you do this? And can you create something affordable? So what happened there was, I think, okay, the first report was 4 pages long. It now runs to about 70 or 80 pages a month. And, we cover things like gold, the S&P 500, crude oil, Bitcoin, dollar index, euro, and do a geopolitical outlook most months, so you can see what's coming up. So that then takes you to this area of retail marketing. And what happened then was people would buy the report and they say, well, I don't know what to do with it. And you think, well, this is exactly why I didn't want to put it out, because a hedge fund just adds it to part of their decision-making process, and it's very easy. They're very happy, and that's it. So we then put together a trading course, which is what I used successfully to harness these markets with. So we put that out there. Then we put another advanced course out there. So the idea is that basically really gone into this pathway of becoming, it's a business. It's a strong business, and it has a lot of people. We have a lot of clients. So you end up having to focus a lot more on marketing and less on trading and investing. And up to last year, I was running a fund, and we were eating our own cooking, and that closed up. It was based in America. It was up 32%, beat the S&P by 48% at the end of 2022. So the stuff works. So that's the history of the report. But you can't please everybody, because people buy the report and say, I don't know how to use it. And then I remember one email coming in through the support, my support team there, and they were saying, this person's really angry. They bought the report and they say you're just trying to upsell them into courses. And I said, just send them the money back. It's the opposite. We didn't want to write a report. You wanted it, and here it is. Now don't complain about it, or make sure you know how to use it. So it's a little bit like if you're going to get into a complex car, a race car, or a plane, you really need to know how to fly it. Yeah. And therefore you have to provide the tools to teach people how to drive that car, race it, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
that's the history of the report.
From the outside, for people who are completely uninitiated to the world of investment, I suppose sometimes it can seem like a bit of a dark art. How could I possibly pick from all of these potential investment opportunities? How can I pick the winning one or the winning set? When you come to an industry that has so much sort of variance in the way that people approach how to invest, did you meet lots of resistance to the idea of patterns and cycles, or do you still meet resistance to the idea of patterns and cycles?
That's a brilliant question. Absolutely. There, the most of the big players really look at fundamental information. Okay.
Right.
So what they see in the news, what they think's coming up, what's going to happen in the presidential elections, what's going to happen here, what's going to happen with China, uh, Israel, Middle East, Russia, and they'll take a view on it. But they can't time those things. So what I found was that it's very much like Marmite. It's very polarizing. People either want it or they don't want it.
Yeah.
Um, Back in the late 90s, one of my clients, it was actually his number two guy that found me, was a very well-known, or actually is a very well-known billionaire. We have a non-disclosure, so I can't tell you who it is, but he is a household name. And they were really into this, but they kept it so quiet. One of the largest funds in America at the time, and there was so much security in inner circle rooms, and you'd go to a room within a room with it, and each time the door was being locked behind you before you started chatting about these patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And they were I was helping them putting some of these patterns together. And one of the big things we noted, was that this was coming up to 2000, 2001, and that things tend to move in 18-year patterns because it's a generation. So if we take 4 18s, that's 72 years. And what we find is that, there's a stock market crash in 1929 that people have read about. If you go back 72 years before that, 1857 had the biggest modern day financial meltdown, not just in America, but also Europe. So projecting that forward from 1929 took us to 2001. But you've got to give it a tolerance of one. So we knew that when we got to 2000, that this massive bull market in the dot-com era was very much at risk. Mm-hmm. And this was the area that this was a sort of thing at a super macro level that these guys were prepared. They closed the fund down, even though they were giving tremendous returns, and that's the way to do it. They did regroup afterwards. But equally, we talk about the 100-year cycle, which now I've quoted in aviation and also in pandemics. One of the things I was briefing people about in 2006, and I was over with a high net worth group in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we were talking about this, was that next year, 2007, would be critical because it's 100 years on from the rich man's panic and 200 years on from the 1807 Embargo Act panic, which happened in the Napoleonic Wars. So we knew that was coming up, And, if you take that, 1807 plus half cycle 50 takes us to 1857, which if anybody was listening, that's the same number that's 72 years back from 1929. So you can see there's this cosmic web weaving and knitting together of mathematical patterns. So we now know that, 2057 will be a panic year. So, write that down for your grandkids or, maybe actually your kids. We're already in 2024,
Yeah, absolutely.
aren't we? So,
I'll be telling now, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, so in answer to your question, but for the most part, it's got a lot of prejudice around it. And I tried for about 3 or 4 years to try and convert people by standing on a metaphorical soapbox. And there's no point. And that takes us all the way back to the very first question you asked about, what's a difficult pitch? And actually, I'm here. If you want to talk to me about cycles, be my guest. There's tea, cake, biscuits, wine, whatever you want. But I'm not here to try and convince you because actually I need people like you who are not convinced to get the relative advantage over. Yeah. Because trading is a war. It's a battle. You're in the boxing ring. You're taking money of somebody else. It's not it's if you're making, somebody's handing that over to you. And if you want to succeed, you've got to have the person to take it off because they're a willing participant. So there's nothing wrong there. Yeah. So, we do need a good pool of non-believers to maintain our lifestyle.
You've mentioned 100-year patterns, or 100-year cycle, a 72-year cycle, an 18-year cycle. If we look at stuff on a more kind of short-term basis,
Yeah.
for business owners, for salespeople, are there any particular cycles that we should be paying attention to when we're pitching to our prospects? You know, within the year, time of the month, and the number of contacts. Is it like, have you got down into that sort of granular level? Are you noticing anything there?
There are times. So um, this first week of the year is quite exciting. Sorry, the first week of any year tends to be quite exciting for those who are looking forward. But on a emotional level, there tends to be quite a few stresses at the beginning of the year. Whereas the back end of the year, people are looking forward to holidays and they're more optimistic. But they're
Yeah.
also more focused on family stuff as we celebrate holidays, Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever, and all this sort of stuff. So basically, you do have that. So human sentiment's different. So typically, for most people at the beginning of the year, it tends to have a lower level of sort of excitement, and that sort of heads up from there into about May, when we get into the northern hemisphere, the summer season. Then it's like, let's wrap up for a couple of months whilst the kids are off. So you've got to decide. So what I would say in answer to your question, certainly if you're going to start a business to do with markets or trading or anything like that, you want to be starting the first week of September, which means you want to have your plans made 2 months before that, and it's not just trading. I know the first week of September, the second week of September, it's a good time to get people interested if they want your product. Equally, round about March, people are more optimistic. This is just, an annual cycle, so I think that's what you're aiming at there, isn't it? So there are
Yeah,
definitely those sorts of opportunities. Yeah.
it's interesting because if we really sort of pay attention, I think intuitively we understand that as human beings as well, and we feel it. We feel the ebb and the flow of the year, and we feel our own sort of energy and excitement versus those times, especially in the northern hemisphere, where it's cold outside and dark, and the sun doesn't come up until 8 o'clock, and you just want to stay in bed. And I think paying attention to those things is actually really important. That's not to say never get out of bed, but actually just be aware of when to put your foot on the accelerator, and when
Yeah.
maybe to put your foot on the brake. You've got a book that is nestling over your shoulder there, the 0 Hour. That was written back in 2017, I believe. So talk to me a little bit about the process of getting a book like that published, because it's published by Penguin, so a big publishing house. How did you pitch that idea? How did you get them on board?
Okay, so this is one of these put the wish out there and it will sort itself out. Well, first of all,
Okay.
let's head back to 2008, when I was over in South Beach with a guy called Tony Robbins and a very famous investment manager called Jim Rogers and a guy called Harry Dent. And Harry Dent is a specialist in demographics. He can make predictions based on how the population is evolving in terms of age group. So, he will tell you that somebody aged 42 buys the most number of crisps, as we call them, potato chips, as they're called in America, because they have the most number of teenagers. So if you can see a bulge in 5 years' time of 42-year-olds coming up due to the birth rates, you want to be investing in a crisp company, right? Harley Davidson's the same thing, and retirement homes, cruise ships. He's got it nailed. So I'd read all of Harry's stuff, and this is going to be the worst answer to a very good question, but I met Harry at this event, and there weren't actually that many of us that were involved in the financial industry. And actually, some of my Bob, Jim Rogers, is usually unavailable. I've got a great association with him. Well, Harry and I hit it off, and we went on to become very big mates. We still are very big mates. And, he would be one of my heroes. I'd studied all his work, didn't necessarily always agree with it.
Yeah.
He was one of the people that encouraged me to write the market timing report. And I wrote a particular edition where it was before, it was in early 2016, where we could see Brexit looming, and then the arrival of Trump as a potential candidate. So there is a revolutionary cycle of 82 to 84 years. It's a bit vague.
Hmm.
So I was working this backwards, and I noticed if we went back to around about 1932, 33, we see the rise of Hitler replacing Hindenburg, because the people in Germany were strapped with huge amounts of reparations from the Great War, the First World War. And you take that same 82 to 84 year cycle back, and it brings us to 1848 and the revolutions led by Karl Marx in January 1848. Him and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto: workers, rise up and break free of your chains. So this was because Europe itself was moving from an agrarian economy into an industrial nation, and people were really being abused, in the sweatshops. But you can go back again the same amount, same time period. So you've got these three kind of loops, and that takes us to the Stamp Act, which really precipitated the American Revolution, and that worked out around about a 240 to 250 year cycle. And we double that back up, and that takes us to 31st of October 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, starting the Protestant Reformation. So what we were doing was projecting all these cycles forward and saying, well, we're in a modern day revolution, which of course what happened. We have Brexit, we have Trump, we see we've gone from globalization to polarization. We see migration problems. We see a change of empire shift with China potentially in the ascendancy, America deteriorating. So I wrote all this up there, and Harry called up saying, this is a pretty interesting article. And I said, I've got loads more on this. And, I've just scribbled them out in notepads. So the long and short of it was that we talked about that, and then I actually got quite ill and had a tumour removed, and I can't sit still and do nothing. So my wife was saying, well, you got to do nothing for 10 weeks, 12 weeks. And I said, no, I'm going to write that book. And basically, I wrote it, and he said, right, so how are we going to get this published? He said, why don't you call up Harry, see if he wants to collaborate.
Yeah.
So I called up Harry. He said, no, I just put a book out. And then he said, send me a script or something. So I sent him some of it. And he called back and said, let's do it. So Harry happens to be a New York Times best-selling author, and that's how you get a contract.
Okay.
Yeah. So somebody's got to do it. It might as well be you.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, that's not the ideal answer that those of you wanted a Penguin portfolio contract to hear. But
No.
that is how it does work. I just thought, I actually visualized the book. I thought, what, it'd be pretty cool to see this in Barnes and Noble and Smiths and everywhere, Waterstone. So, but I was lucky with that. I was very great. I'm very grateful to Harry. And, the funny thing with Harry, we talk about fated connections. We hit it off. He contacted me afterwards, and I was thinking, wow, this guy's contacting me. Then I started dating a girl about 3 months later, and I was just chatting to her, and she's an American in New York. She's my wife, and basically I said, what are you doing? She said, oh, we're going to go and see this gospel creature. I was, you into all that? She said, well, me and my two girlfriends find them fascinating because they get everybody sort of, wound up and riled, and it gets mental, and it's really interesting watching the mass psychology. So I called her the next day, and she said, oh, one of my girlfriends knows you. And I was like, oh, who's that? I wouldn't know any of you. And it's like, oh, well, she's married to a guy called Harry Dent. So I said, no way. So the four of us became such big friends that we would meet all the way around in different places of the world, bit here, different parts of America, Caribbean. And not only would we sort of enjoy, a very convivial meal, some wine and all that sort of stuff, we'd have these very deep conversations, not just about markets, but about, human behavior, demographics, esoteric stuff. And so this is, when you talk about how do you find a mentor, I think this is how people, he would be one of them that, that does come to us. And it's really nice to do that book, with him, and the fact that actually leave it with me. And, so I'm sorry, that's probably an alternative way of getting a publishing contract.
But it's all about being in the right place at the right time, but being prepared to share your ideas, not holding on to things. You were making things happen by publishing that material and getting it out into the right hands. And I think so often we can kind of sit on things until everything comes into alignment. We have this kind of goal out there, and everything's focused towards it. Whereas, that's a great example of what our friend Trevor Blake talks about, life filling in the details, and I think that's really, really important sometimes.
And I think the other thing is, as Trevor does say, you don't know what business you're in until you start your business. And I think that's very important as well, because I
Yeah.
wasn't in the newsletter business, and it's not something I really aspire to be in, but it does, through that we get other connections because other people see it and they come in. And, yesterday I was with, through this, one of the military contacts, and you find some fascinating information out as you share that, So
Yeah.
definitely it opens new, and I think that's the whole thing. Is you've got to let go of the oars and let the stream, the current of the stream take you, or the river. Everything you need is downstream, and there's a lot of fighting it, in early days. And I think, what? Well, we're here, so we might as well just go with the flow, because it's going to take us somewhere that maybe we're supposed to be that we don't know about.
So that leads me to another question, which is in that cycles research, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned? Like what came along that you weren't looking for?
The level of predictability of human behavior, I think, and it's now got to the point where it doesn't surprise me anymore because I'm looking for it. So if we
Right.
talk about the reticular activating system or concentration tunneling, I'm now looking for a cycle, and then I'm looking to prove it or disprove it, as the case may. I want to seek the truth, so I'm not curve fitting.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole thing, is that when you know that things can be forecast, and when you can have a roadmap ahead, then you can plan yourself with a bit more certainty for yourself and your family. I think,
Mhm.
the narrative, it's like the pandemic. For some people, it was like the end of the world. And I get that people lost their jobs and, had terrible problems. For other people, it was a golden opportunity. So, it's all things to all men. And I think that's the thing, is that if you go with the flow, and if you can see where the opportunity lies in all of it, then I think
Mm.
that's something. It's not easy to do, but that's where you got to look for the opportunities.
Amazing, Andrew. I could talk about this all day, and there's so many more questions that I want to ask you, but I want to wrap up with a final one, and I'd like to take you back to that 4-year-old boy getting into the cockpit on that flight to India. If you could go back and give one piece of advice to that young man, what would it be?
I think somebody's got to do it. It might as well be you, as the legendary John Fenton, as he was known, always said. I think, whatever it is, whatever your dream is, for whoever's watching this, whatever your vision is, Jeff Bezos didn't get to where he wanted to be. That was his vision and dream. And, when I talk to some of the multi-billionaire fund managers, and I know 5 or 6 of them that are interested in this work, they're all just regular human beings who didn't have any money at one point, or very little. Not many were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And it was just a vision. And in fact, that wealth is a byproduct. It's not, if they're still passionate about what they do, and the wealth is just a byproduct. It just means they can go and, have houses all over the world and jets and whatever it is. I mean, I don't aspire to that. I've got a nice house. That's it. It's my home. It's my passions, my library. I spend a lot of money collecting rare esoteric books from 500 years ago and stuff like that. But whatever it is, just be you and follow your passion. And remember, if you have doubts about whether you can get that gold medal, if it's a sporting thing or whatever, just remember somebody's got to do it. It might as well be you. And you won't get it straight away, I don't think, but you never know. The road is rarely smooth, and it has interesting turns, and there are decisions to be made. And sometimes you might wish you've chosen the blue tablet instead of the red tablet, or vice versa, as in the Matrix. Not modern tablets, right? So, so I think it's just believe, follow your passion, believe it, and know somebody's got to do it, and it might as well be you.
Awesome advice. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Thanks for listening to the Why Life's a Pitch podcast. If you'd like to improve the way you pitch and communicate, I'm giving away a special gift to all my listeners. We've developed the Pitching with Impact scorecard to help you benchmark your pitch performance in 6 key areas. It'll take you less than 5 minutes to complete, and you'll receive a detailed, personalised report packed full of insights and ideas to help you improve and grow. Just head over to dominiccolenso.com/scorecard to get started.